TPC Sawgrass is one of the most recognizable golf courses in the world, but I don't think it's especially well understood. Its design is more subtle and sophisticated than I think many people give it credit for. So in today's episode of Designing Golf, I'm talking with my colleague Joseph LaMagna about what makes TPC Sawgrass great. I'm Garrett Morrison, and this is Designing Golf. All right, Joseph, I think you're the number one fan of TPC Sawgrass on the Friday golf staff. That's why I wanted you to be on this pod. Do you think it's the best non-major venue on the PGA Tour?
I do. I also really love Muirfield Village, and I think it gives it a run for its money. Also interesting in doing some prepping for this pod, some of the similarities between the golf course and reading Bury Me in a Pot Bunker, but Pete Dye's book in preparation for this pod. Muirfield Village is actually referenced in that chapter about TPC Sawgrass. So I'd say it's one of those two. I would put TPC Sawgrass a little bit ahead of Muirfield Village, but yeah, big fan of this golf course. I love the Players' Championship.
Unexpectedly, also Glen Abbey, the longtime former Canadian Open host, is mentioned in that chapter in Pete Dye's book as well. May come as a surprise to some people who are familiar with Glen Abbey, but that was actually a reference point for Pete Dye in designing TPC Sawgrass, and we can maybe touch on that later. But a great book that I recommended a couple of episodes ago when I talked with Stephen Proctor about the golf architecture books that everyone should read. Bury Me in a Pot Bunker is really essential reading whenever a Pete Dye course pops up on the PGA Tour. So we are going to be cribbing a lot of little factoids from that chapter, probably, right?
Yeah. Some explosive quotes, some construction talk. I don't know if we'll get into the construction talk, but I think the explosive quotes and how much players hated it will probably come up.
Absolutely. The players' reaction to the course was notable, and I think has been somewhat forgotten. And it's especially surprising to see some of the names come up in that story. It's some players complaining about the course that you wouldn't expect, perhaps, to complain about interesting golf architecture. So that's all part of the TPC Sawgrass story. We'll get into some of it in this episode, but our main intention here is just to lay out the things that we love about this course and a couple of things that we think could be better about TPC Sawgrass. So we each came with 3 things we like and 1 thing that we dislike. So let's dive into the likes. What is your first thing that you love about TPC Sawgrass?
I think the one I want to lead with, because it may facilitate discussion in some of the other ones that we have prepared, but I love the interaction between the small greens and the hazards at TPC Sawgrass. And what that ultimately leads to, I don't want to get too technical with analytics type jargon, but
why not?
You essentially have to aim away from hazards, right? That's a huge tenet of modern course management that clearly Pete Dye understood that pretty well when he was laying out this golf course. It's a great example is the 16th hole, par 5, that I think most people would recognize, where you have a small green and you might be hitting something from 225, 230 out, where if you were to aim at the center of that green, you'd be bringing that water on the right side into play. And so what you see is some of the savviest, most course management sound, trained, disciplined golfers like Scotty Scheffler, they're aiming at the left side of that green. And that brings a lot of chip shots into your range of outcomes. And so you see a lot of players who they have other traits as well, but you tend to see a lot of players with good short game excel on this golf course. And that's a big part of the reason why. So Cam Smith, Siwoo Kim, these are Justin Thomas, past champions with very strong short game. And that's part of the reason, is that you're kind of having to aim away into the fairway, think about where you want to leave it around greens, but taking some of these hazards out of play that are up around the greens. And these if the greens were 8,000 square feet, that'd be less of a consideration. But since they're small, they're 5,500 square feet on average. You just can't aim directly at the center. You'd be bringing too much penalty into play.
Would you say that a distinctive thing about TPC Sawgrass is how close the greenside hazards are to certain pin positions, like how they really impinge upon important areas of the green?
I think 16 is a great example of that.
Yeah.
One thing I'd be curious for your perspective. I mean, there are some areas where in the fairway, a lot of bunkers are keeping balls from going into hazards that feels distinctly TPC Sawgrass. Like I'm thinking of the 6th hole, and there's a number of holes where a fairway bunker kind of lines the side of a fairway.
Yeah.
But
right.
Up around the greens, yeah, I mean, the 4th hole would be another example. I love the 4th hole. 16's probably the best example. 11's a good example. So, yeah, I would certainly agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, from an architectural perspective, not just purely from an analytical or course management perspective, the variety of the green complexes at TPC Sawgrass is outstanding. The greens are contoured differently. They're not the biggest greens, and so finding that variety is sort of a design feat. But the way the hazards interact with the greens, the interface between the putting surface and the surrounds of the greens is always different. It's different from hole to hole to hole and really inventive. And that's something that I love about this golf course. It's so creative how Dye designed the surrounds of these greens and how many different ways he found to do something unique with each green complex. The bunkers are always kind of snaking around the greens in different ways and pushing into the putting surface in different ways. Sometimes there's water, sometimes there's trees, sometimes there are these little nests of mounds. It's always something different. And I think that keeps players off balance a bit going through the golf course and provides some excitement, some variety. And so I think that's something that's absolutely outstanding about TPC Sawgrass. And it's something that when you see other architects try to imitate Pete Dye's style, that they don't quite get in the same way, because it takes real skill to design greens in this way. And so that's something, that's one of the biggest things I really like about this golf course. So I should roll in then to my first thing that I love about TPC Sawgrass, and it relates to what I was just talking about there. I really like how the kind of overtly manufactured shaping of this golf course actually looks really cool. TPC Sawgrass is a completely fabricated course. The land was essentially a forest that had been flooded as a side effect of the construction of the Intercoastal Waterway. And there was very little of the pre-existing landscape that could or should have been preserved. So in manufacturing the course, it was not Dye's intent to make it look like it had always been there. He was creating something different. He was building a stadium, right? His brief was to build a golf stadium. And the word stadium kind of comes with an implication of a heavily manufactured aesthetic. And so he was not going for natural. He was going for something a little more heightened. And that doesn't always result in great things. That doesn't always result in great architecture. Often when architects go for this kind of maximalist look, they don't end up with something that looks interesting. Usually it looks sort of cheesy. One podcast ago, PJ brought up the waterfalls at Valhalla. That's sort of an example of the result you often get when architects go big like this or come up with something manufactured or heightened. I think Pete Dye had really good taste in manufacturing the aesthetics of his golf course, of all of his golf courses, in fact. He kind of gives these shapes a handcrafted, irregular appearance that, especially in the early versions of TPC Sawgrass, was really successful. He uses contrast extremely well. Think of the contrast between the big, long waste areas at Sawgrass and then the very tiny, kind of pushed up pot bunkers. So he uses that kind of strange contrast to really striking effect. And then he also has this eye for asymmetrical shapes and arrangements. right? And these unexpected flourishes, unbalanced looks. Around the greens, you see these kind of sudden nests of pot bunkers, but that's not extended all the way around the green in a regular way. It's always kind of surprising where these little bits of fabricated stuff show up on the course. And so again, it always kind of keeps you off balance. And I think it's to me, a really pleasing aesthetic that the course has. And just compared to a lot of the other courses that were built in this era, and in fact, a lot of the courses that were inspired by TPC Sawgrass and Harbor Town and other die courses from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, TPC Sawgrass now does not look nearly as cheap or as dated as a lot of those courses. And I think that's because of Dye's control over and eye for the aesthetics of his shaping. Does that resonate with you at all?
It does. I think TPC Sawgrass is stunning, especially when it's presented in the appropriate light, so to speak. I think there are probably a number of golf courses that are inspired in some way by TPC Sawgrass. One that comes to mind as you're going through that explanation that might, I don't know if gaudy is the right word, but might be a little bit more overtly manufactured, would be Le Golf National in France, which
it's a great example.
I think
because clearly Dye inspired, right?
It's
to
clearly
the point
Dye.
that people often think when they look at the course, well, did Pete Dye design this?
It has a lot of resemblance, and I think the other trait it shares, which I'm sure there's reasons people would like to be critical of Le Golf National. I don't think it's anywhere near the masterpiece that TPC Sawgrass is, but these moguls serve a distinct purpose aside from the playability of the golf course, which is offering vantage points for fans, which is something that was clearly a point of emphasis from the construction of TPC Sawgrass. And I think Pete Dye's brilliance in putting together a routing that was conducive to hosting a big tournament and giving fans strong vantage points without compromising on the architecture is a really impressive part of the story here. So that's one thing I admire about this golf course is to your point, kind of marrying that manufactured look with utility and not disrupting the golf. It's tough to do all of that on a piece of land that was flat and carved out of a swamp.
Right. Yeah. The form of TPC Sawgrass is following its function, right? Its function was to be a golf stadium, and everything that Pete Dye did in designing the course kind of was the servant of that purpose. But at the same time, trying to construct a stadium, you might end up with something really regular looking, really constructed looking, and maybe not that interesting because most stadiums are very symmetrical. But with TPC Sawgrass, Dye was very smart about how he broke up that regularity and made it interesting to look at. And I think that's something that Sawgrass does exceptionally well that other stadium courses, including ones that Dye built later, don't do nearly as well. I think Le Golf National is a perfect example. To me, the aesthetics of that course, the shaping of that course, aren't nearly as pleasing to the eye. They're more regular to me, that there's not that kind of flair of the unexpected and the surprising as you go through that golf course and look at its forms. Though, I'm not trying to bash Le Golf National. It's not bad, right? It's not a bad version of this kind of golf. It just doesn't quite get to the heights of Sawgrass. So what's your second thing that you like?
I'll go with something that we probably talked about in the past on fried egg channels, but how good the par fives are.
Oh yeah.
I think that it might be the best set of par fives in non-major championship golf. It's hard to pick a favorite. I think 9 is such an incredible par 5. Tends to be the most
brilliant.
difficult. Yeah, it tends to be the most difficult of the par 5s at Sawgrass, and the care about where you're going to miss around that green, whether if you put the ball in play off the tee, if you're going to go for it or not, is a real conversation. It depends on the wind, depends on the pin and where you can leave it, how soft the green is. Like there's way more factoring into that decision than your standard run of the mill par 5 on the PGA Tour. But you could also pick any of the other 3 par 5s and talk about different elements of them and what makes them fascinating. So I'm a huge fan of the par 5s. Probably the bright spots of the golf. I mean, there's so many great golf holes out here, but I think the par 5s are probably among the best.
9 and 11 stand out to me as being just the top of the heap among par 5s, not only at TPC Sawgrass, but on the PGA Tour, maybe just in golf in general. They're so creative in how they use this sort of zigzag shape that Pete Dye really liked for par 5s, right? There's kind of an almost double dogleg element to a lot of the par 5s that Pete Dye designed for his championship courses. And I think part of the point of this is that zigzag shape in a par 5 creates a couple of options. You can follow the zigzag, which is the conservative way of playing the hole, or you can take some risks and try to make the zigzag straight, essentially try to play straight up the hole, cutting off the corners of the zigzag, reach the green in 2. Those are the kind of options that a zigzag par 5 creates for you. And the way that these particular zigzag par 5s work makes it so they can't really be dominated by power that much, right? Some holes at some par 5s at TPC Sawgrass more than others have been susceptible to power. I think that 16 has really changed in the way that it plays, right? It plays more like a long par 4 now, but a really interesting long par 4. But if you look at 9, you just can't dominate that hole with power at all, really. All of the par 5s are kind of short by the modern standards of the PGA Tour, but somehow or another, through the use of water and trees and this kind of zigzag, these snaking shapes that he gave to the par 5s, you just can't overwhelm these par 5s, I guess.
Yeah, a couple things there. I mean, one trait of TPC Sawgrass that this is one way in which it's similar to Muirfield Village is that it's kind of, most fairways are bound on the outer bounds either by trees or some kind of hazard. So it does kind of prevent, it's like the anti-Torrey pines where you can miss really wide out there and you're fine. You can't do that at Sawgrass. So it prevents players from taking driver, maybe aiming down the right side if there's a hazard on the left and swinging freely and not worrying too much if that ball flares out too far to the right. You can't do that at TPC Sawgrass because generally there's either some kind of water hazard lining one of the sides of the fairway or trees or both. So that's one reason. I think with 11, one thing you're touching on, and not to allude to potential negatives that we'll get to later, but I don't think there's a better example of a hole that should play firm than the 11th hole. Because what's such a cool part about the challenge of 11 is that to the left of the green, there's water to the right of the green, but to the left of the green, it's short grass. And you have to actually control where that approach shot is going to end up. It's pretty rare on the PGA Tour at this point to have long irons into a green surrounded by short grass. Like, that's not the setup of most PGA Tour courses. We've kind of surrounded them all by thick rough. And so the more that ball can bounce and travel potentially into bad locations is such a part of the appeal of TPC Sawgrass. Not every hole, but I think 11's a really good example of that. And so when you're talking about you can't just overpower it, both of those factors are at play there, right? You can't just pound a driver anywhere and not worry about where it ends up. And then on the approach shot, it's not just hitting some kind of moonshot 7-iron that you're trying to carry a front bunker and get it to stop. Like on 11 here, you actually have to worry about where it's going to end up if you can control that, especially if it's firm.
There's a certain randomness left of the 11th green. And just to give people a picture, if you end up over there on 11, which is an understandable place to end up because right of the green / short of the green, you have water. So the bailout is going to be to the left. You have short grass over there. But if you end up over there, you've got a couple of pot bunkers that guard that side of the green or guard that side of the green area in general. And then you have this kind of contoured short grass. So you could end up with these extremely scary chips back to the green. And if it's firm, then you're trying to clip it off of firm turf to a green that's also firm and you're worried about potentially running through or coming up short in one of these pop bunkers. And so if it is firm, if you bring that element of agronomy that should be there, then that is a very frightening shot. If it's soft, then the top players in the world aren't really going to be all that terrified of missing left on 11. So I agree that the golf course needs to bring that extra element for some of these holes really to come alive.
I guess just while we're here, because some of this crossover with Muirfield Village, the only reason I think it's important to keep hammering it is because one of the great players of that era, Jack Nicklaus, designed that place. And I do think there's some clear crossover in what Pete Dye was thinking and what Jack Nicklaus was thinking. But a huge element of Muirfield Village is that when you get offline, off the tee, it forces you to lay up because there are hazards short of the green. This is like a common, it's on a lot of the holes at Muirfield Village. 11 at Sawgrass is another example where having that hazard cut off the fairway pretty significantly short leaves yourself, 90, 100-yard wedge in.
Right. The layup zone is way to the right too. It's kind of like off of the path to the green. You have to really redirect your path to the hole in order to lay up on the hole, basically.
Exactly. So if you're a little bit offline off of the tee, it kind of forces you to hit into that area. Otherwise, like you're trying to hit a really risky shot up by that green, which, especially if it's firm, could end up anywhere. So it's one of Muirfield Village really penalizes you by distance, like by forcing you into a wedge if you are offline. And there's a little bit of that at Sawgrass. The 11th is probably the best example, but it's a cool way to test accuracy, and it's a very effective strategy that Pete Dye deploys here.
Yeah, and I think this is the element that makes TPC Sawgrass, or one of the elements, but maybe one of the main elements that makes TPC Sawgrass a tournament golf course, a golf course for professional golfers. And Muirfield Village, I would say the same, because this characteristic of a golf course does not tend to be very accommodating of average players. This is not a type of design that you would introduce to a golf course that you mean to have the purpose of appealing to average golfers. This is a kind of design that is really suited to tournament play. And maybe that's where these different types of golf courses, the professional golf venue versus the venue for everyone, this is where they diverge a little bit. And I think that there should be both in the world of golf, but I'll always be a little bit challenged to love a golf course that can't do both, right? That can't appeal to the average player as well as appeal to the professional player, which isn't to say that TPC Sawgrass doesn't appeal to the average player. It seems that average players love going there and playing the golf course, seeing this place and enjoying it, but they do get beat up by it. It doesn't necessarily present a great model for building a golf course for the average player. And part of the reason for that is because of the use of hazards in this manner, where if you want to lay up, you can't get close to the green. You got to lay up way back, and then you're faced with almost an equally difficult shot the next time. This is a type of design that is really suited to tournament play as opposed to everyday play.
Yeah, I think TPC Sawgrass is maybe a little more playable than some other very tournament style courses like Muirfield Village. Mm-hmm. But yes, point taken. Like the tee shot on 18 at TPC Sawgrass is not for the 12 handicap. So I am with you almost entirely. I just think it's slightly more playable than like the most aggressive style of that test.
I agree with that. And I think that a big reason that it is slightly more playable than the likes of Muirfield Village or maybe some other PGA Tour courses or major championship courses. Yeah, Bay Hill is a perfect example. One of the reasons for that is that Pete Dye really uses diagonals at TPC Sawgrass quite a bit. And this use of diagonals is something that can make a course well suited to high-level professional play as well as average everyday play. Because when you have a fairway that's moving on a diagonal in relation to the tee, the good player is looking to cut off that diagonal and to make the longer carry. And it's not that hard for them to make these longer carries these days, but they're looking to cut off as much of it as possible and get up the corridor of the hole. Whereas the average player has some room to play short and doesn't have to make as big of a carry in some of these situations. I think because TPC Sawgrass uses diagonals so insistently throughout the course, that the course is still relatively playable for average golfers in some way. But just to dig into this idea of diagonals at TPC Sawgrass, just about every hole, or at least every long hole at TPC Sawgrass, has some kind of diagonal element, right? Either it's a fairway that's moving on a diagonal in relation to the tee, or it's a diagonal hazard that is interacting with the line of play in some way. And Pete Dye often uses these diagonals in a classic golden age way to create strategy. So the bigger the carry you make, the closer you're able to play to the inside of the diagonal, which might be pressed up against a hazard, the easier your next shot is going to be. But in addition to that, I think Pete Dye uses diagonals just to create discomfort and doubt about club selection. And I think probably the most familiar example of this is on the tee shot on the 18th hole, where the fairway runs on a right to left diagonal, pressed hard against a lake on the left side. And it's just an extraordinarily uncomfortable shot because players today are trained to get as far down the fairway as possible on any given hole. But to do that here, you have to really aim out over the water and trust your shot. And if you don't trust your shot, if you bail out to the right and you take too much club, then you're ending up in the trees on the right side of the fairway. I think that's just a very uncomfortable thing for a player to, a high level player to confront, because they have to marry their intended distance with their line in a really specific way, make a choice and commit to it fully, hit a good shot, because the consequences of missing on either side of the diagonal are pretty severe. Another of my favorite diagonals is on the 9th hole, where that canal crosses the fairway on a diagonal itself. And it's a really creative use of a diagonal, because in order to get that angle into the green that is not obstructed by trees on the left side of the run up to the green, you either have to play short, like well short of the canal, or you have to play really close to the canal. Because if you blast it down the fairway, the farther down the fairway you go, the more left you have to go in order to avoid going into the water. But the more left you go, the more blocked out by trees on the next shot you're going to be. So again, you have to make a choice on this hole. Yeah, if you want to go way down the fairway, then your next shot might have some tree trouble unless you play really close to the water. If you play well short of the canal, then you're just going to have a really long second shot you might be forced to lay up. And so almost every really great hole at TPC Sawgrass has some element like this, these diagonals. And I think it's the secret sauce that allows TPC Sawgrass to be durable as a tournament venue, because Pete Dye uses diagonals and doesn't just give you a straight corridor to play down. If you have a straight corridor to play down, today's best players are just going to move it way down that corridor. But Pete Dye's holes are always moving or snaking or slanting in some way. And that's what continues to create the challenge. And that's what the defense against pure distance continues to be at TPC Sawgrass, I think. I guess just two thoughts on two of those examples you brought up. Maybe I'm reaching a little bit, but that's just the way that my brain works. I think, your description of 9, the par 5, in some ways is kind of similar to 8 at Augusta National, where, if you challenge the right side a little bit, like you're contending with less tree trouble on a very aggressive second shot that you may or may not be able to pull off based on how well you execute your tee shot. So they don't look exactly the same, but what they share is that it's a very long second approach shot where if you go too far left, you have to hit some kind of draw in, which is
increasingly difficult for the modern player who predominantly hits a fade. So I love the example you used on the 9th. On the 18th, I think another really cool element that's related, I think part of the reason that hole has aged so well is because a lot of players increasingly hit a fade off of the tee, and that hole does call for a draw. And what you'll see is that Scottie Scheffler, every time he talks about this in his press conferences, he's hitting a draw there with a 3-wood because the modern driver doesn't really accommodate a draw. It's much more difficult to control. And we almost saw Justin Thomas hit that like snap draw with his driver when in contention.
Thomas
it almost
does that
went
on
in the
both
water.
16 and 18 at Sawgrass.
It probably should have gone in the water, right? Especially if it were a little firmer.
Tiger does it too. Tiger plays that same shot on 18. And it's always a little bit scary because you're like, oh, that ball seems like it's maybe not completely in control.
Right. And if you were to hit a fade and it didn't fade back, right, you could be re-teeing. Versus if you hit a draw, and this is something Scotty talks about, worst case, it bounces into the water, but you know it's crossing up there and you can drop up there instead of re-teeing. So it's cool, A, because most players hit a fade and it doesn't call for that, but I think it's also built in. Like there's so many stock shots on the PGA Tour, but you kind of know when you get to 18, like, all right, Scotty's going to hit this little draw with his 3-wood. It establishes this mental cadence of the hurdles that a golfer has to overcome on the way in. Obviously, 17 is another example of that, where the fan knows what's coming. I think the 18th tee shot is another cool example of that, where you're going to see some golfers are going to hit their stock fade with driver and aim down the right center, but Scotty's going to hit that draw with a 3-wood, aim down the right side of the fairway and drop back. I think it's just cool to see those shots and be able to anticipate them.
Yeah, playing a fade off of that tee feels a little bit insane because your margin for error is so slim. Whereas playing that draw gives you a little bit more room to work with and landing the ball and letting it run out the way that it runs out when it's moving right to left. So it's one of those rare holes that kind of encourages shot shaping without the use of trees.
Yeah,
really. I mean, there are trees on the right side of the fairway, but it's not directing the shape of the shot like the trees do on the 10th hole at Augusta National. It is encouraging that shot because of the nature of the landing zone and the hazards that are guarding the fairway, which is pretty cool design in my book. This episode of Designing Golf is brought to you by the USGA Greens section. One of the biggest trends in golf course maintenance is data collection, and no management system today makes collecting data easier than Deacon from the USGA Greens section. Data collection tools like the GS3 ball and the new USGA moisture meter seamlessly connect and instantly upload data in the Deacon app. Use the data to make decisions, to manage inputs and resources more efficiently, to provide consistent playing conditions, improved playability, and increased golfer satisfaction. With the USGA Green Section's latest upgrade to Deacon, you can get enhanced navigation, robust reporting tools, and decreased testing time. Measure what matters. Get your Deacon tools bundle today at gsshop.usga.org. Thank you to the USGA Green Section for supporting Designing Golf in its early days here. Let's get back to my conversation with Joseph LaMagna about TPC Sawgrass. But let's get to your third point, your third thing that you love about TPC Sawgrass.
This might be like my favorite part of TPC Sawgrass. The cadence of the holes and how well it lends itself to excitement in a tournament that is a television product. Brilliant foresight by Pete Dye. Like the tournament not being over until you have finished the 17th hole, and that anticipation from the time you tee off on the first hole, like I got to get through 17 before this tournament is over. There's such a cool mix of wide range of outcomes on 16. You could make eagle, you could make bogey, then you get to 17, especially if there's wind, any numbers in play, like you could make a 7, and then having to conquer 18, especially that tee shot that we just talked about. I guess I have a differing view from some architectural thought that the closing stretch doesn't need to be dynamite. Like I know there's some pretty underwhelming 18th holes that get put under scrutiny. I do think it's reasonable to be critical of an 18th hole that doesn't ask that much of a player. And as much as I love Augusta National, the climax of that round comes a little earlier than it does at TPC Sawgrass, right? It's really
arguably
like, I would
on the
say
15th.
Yeah, I would say 10 through 15 is like the equivalent of 16 through 18 at Sawgrass. And to me, there's a lot of value, entertainment value in that coming later versus, okay, you finished 15 at Augusta. If you're up by 2, like you're kind of just coasting the last 3 holes, especially if, nobody else is still playing who's in contention. You only just have to get through with a couple pars, maybe a bogey on 18 like Tiger and Scotty have done in the past. Like it's not the most exciting finish. I love Augusta National, to be clear, but Sawgrass in saving that for the end, I think it's really cool cadence, and it just makes for a great golf tournament.
And it's a benefit, I suppose, of manufacturing the course from whole cloth. Because part of the reason the 18th hole at Augusta National is underwhelming is because it has a job to do. It needs to get you back up to the clubhouse. And it's a pretty severe upslope. It would have been hard to create an extremely interesting hole there without moving a lot of earth. And Mackenzie and Jones weren't moving a lot of earth when they made Augusta National. And so part of the purpose of that hole is practical. It's not just to be an interesting hole. Whereas Pete Dye's brief in creating 16 through 18 at TPC Sawgrass was to create this stadium. And he did that. He was able to just build that from the ground up. I mean, literally the lake where the 17th green at TPC Sawgrass is located was dug by the construction crew because there was good sand there that they were able to use to build golf features elsewhere on the course. And they ended up with this big lake, and they were like, all right, I guess we're going to put a green in the middle of it. And that was actually Alice Dye's idea, Pete Dye's wife. And that's how that came about. So it is truly a manufactured environment, and its only purpose is to be exciting. And it does that just brilliantly. You think about the opportunity of the 16th hole. You can make eagle there, but there's a lot of danger if you decide to take that on. You have to hit 2 really good shots to get in position to make eagle on the 16th hole at TPC Sawgrass. The 17th hole is everybody's familiar with it, but there's just that wonderful tension that comes when a player walks up to that tee. And when the ball is in the air, is it going to find the green or is it not? It's one of those A-B penal designs that is really exciting to see in the closing stretch of a golf course. And then 18, we've already talked about. It's a brilliant golf hole. And just the pacing of that finishing stretch, the way that some holes are opportunities where others are ones that you just kind of hold on and survive. Absolutely brilliant, a triumph. It's been imitated elsewhere, but it's never been replicated. It's never been done nearly as well as this. And you just have to look at PGA West, Pete Dye's own PGA West, which tries to achieve this same dynamic, but it doesn't quite get there. It's not quite as good, right? And I think there are a variety of reasons for that. There could be a whole paper on why the finishing stretch at PGA West isn't quite as good as the one at TPC Sawgrass, but it's just to say that not just anybody could create a sequence of holes like this, and it is really an achievement that they are how they are.
I also think from like an entertainment value perspective, walking up 16 and being able to see 17 and see the group ahead of you playing it and hearing the groans of the crowd, the proximity there, it's done in a very tasteful and exciting way. And I guess to just take things, it's similar to 11 and 12 at Augusta, really. Like we have the anecdote of Brooks Koepka hitting a shot into 12 in the water in the 2019 Masters and not wanting to show any kind of emotion because he didn't want Tiger to realize that he had misstruck the iron. And when you have that relationship between players seeing each other on the golf course, They talked about this again at Pinehurst last year at the US Open and how cool it was having the greens and tees in close proximity because you can actually see your playing competitors. Like, that's another benefit of the closing stretch at Sawgrass. But I guess, Garrett, to maybe put an exclamation mark on this point, like, I think if a golf course is being constructed for the purpose of hosting a championship, a high-level championship, to me, like, it should almost be a mandate. Not that mandate's too strong of a word, but to have a strong closing stretch. And I think Sawgrass has set the standard there and sets an expectation for what tournament golf should look like down the closing stretch. And if 17 and 18 are kind of sleeper holes, I wouldn't be as inclined to put a championship there.
Yeah. I think Southern Hills does this really well. To name
That's a great example.
A golden age, a traditional golf course that really nails its closing stretch. So it's not just modern or manufactured courses that can do this. Also, some more naturalistic courses can achieve this dynamic. But certainly, if you are, as you say, building it for the purpose of a championship, then yes, you've got to nail those last few holes, because the benefits of that are so obvious whenever you see a Players Championship and the way that closing stretch just always feels. There's something about it that is just different. And, I think it's so clever. This is the stadium course, right? But the true stadium at the stadium golf course is the second shot on 16, the tee shot on 17, and the tee shot on 18. And those are all in this same kind of amphitheater, right? That's where the closing stretch really unfolds. And there's this kind of cinematic feel about it, because you can see across as soon as you walk up to the 16th green, you can't help but look at the 17th green and the 18th tee and think, I've got to hit those golf shots now. I've got to make that happen. And it's just wonderful. It's cool. It's so familiar to us now that I think we lose perspective on how great it is, but it is truly great. My last thing that I love about TPC Sawgrass is what we've been talking about so far here. And that is the centering of the fan experience, the way that the stadium was constructed. Dean Beeman, the commissioner of the PGA Tour, gave Pete Dye a job to do with the stadium course, and that was to build, this great fan-centric golf stadium. And two ideas that Beeman introduced were that, one, the spectator areas would be higher than the playing surfaces. So you'd kind of build up these structures along the sides of the fairway, and the playing areas would be lower. The greens as well as the fairways would be lower, so that the fans could sit above the players, just as they do at a football stadium or a basketball stadium. And his second idea was very clever and very sophisticated. He wanted a routing that created hubs of activity, or these gathering points where multiple holes would converge and fans could congregate. This is something that Augusta National has that we often talk about, these points on the property where you can sit in one place and watch action on multiple different holes at once. And that's something that Dean Beeman wanted out of Pete Dye's design at TPC Sawgrass, and that Dye delivered in a number of different ways. And so I think that the way that Dye went about designing the spectator areas as well as the golf elements of TPC Sawgrass was extremely successful. And, to start to push into some of our complaints about TPC Sawgrass, I think it is a shame that the PGA Tour has decided to eliminate some of the original grass bleachers that TPC Sawgrass had, and to take away a lot of the original vantage points that Dye created. There used to be this huge embankment in the middle of the lake between the 6th and 7th holes. That used to be a moat, right? That was the first PGA Tour's first moat. But now it's just a big lake. But in the middle of that lake, originally, was this massive set of grass bleachers where you could walk in there and just watch what was going on the 6th and 7th holes. They took that away. I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe they thought spectator flow would be better if there wasn't this kind of, I guess walking out onto a peninsula maybe creates a bit of a choke point. And maybe the logic was similar in taking away the peninsula that used to jut into the lake where the 17th green is. There used to be this big, isthmus. Is that, if that's the right way to, I don't know if that's the right way to pronounce the word. It's one of those words I've only seen in print. But there used to be this big structure that went into the lake and where you could sit and watch everything on the 16th, 17th, and 18th holes. And they took that away as well. It seems to me that some of the kind of democratic nature of TPC Sawgrass that originally was there, the kind of spectator-centered nature of the course, has been taken away because the PGA Tour has decided to eliminate some of these really neat looking spectator areas that used to be there. So that's one criticism that is related to something that I really like about TPC Sawgrass, and that is that it is an exceptional spectator venue by design.
I guess I can go into my negative, which kind of parlays off of that.
Yeah.
I think all the best championships and the best golf courses do everything in mind with maximizing the golf and are unwilling to compromise on that. And Augusta National's a great example of that, right? Like, you don't have, including at other venues, like this was pretty clear at Pinehurst last year at the US Open. Like, you don't have a lot of concession stands and things that interfere with the action. I understand that you need grandstands and there are logistical considerations, but the best championships don't compromise on that. And I think TPC Sawgrass, Pete Dye would not have been the type of person who would have been willing to compromise on the golf at the, for the sake of some of these ulterior motives. To me, the move back to March represents that, the PGA Tour, right? This championship was in March and then it moved to May. And then now it's back in March, and you lose a lot of the firmness of the golf course for the sake of displaying the golf course more green and making it look more visually appealing on TV at the expense of the shot value. We've already talked about multiple times on this podcast why certain shots benefit from firm conditions. Pete Dye explicitly in Bury Me in a Pot Bunker, he says, while I don't have anything to say about the highly manicured condition of the golf course these days, I do believe the rustic nature of the stadium course has been lost over the years, which has lessened its demanding design features. And he explicitly says that the golf course was originally designed to play firm. And we had Gary Young of the PGA Tour, who's chief referee, very involved in setup on the Fried Egg Pod last year. And he explicitly said that the move to March is much more visually appealing while understanding that you lose some of the firm and fast nature of the golf course. So to me, like, my biggest gripe with TPC Sawgrass is, in the Players' Championship in particular, is that it's not playing the way that it should play. And I hope it's obvious from this conversation why firmness is additive to this championship. To me, the move to March is a mistake. When you add in that major championship venues get a little harder for the PGA as well in May to, you're kind of restricted in where parts of the country you can go. Like, that might have made more sense in August. Like, the old schedule might have made a little bit more sense. And certainly I think TPC Sawgrass makes more sense in May than in March.
There was the move to March. And then there has also been the explicit intention of the PGA Tour to make TPC Sawgrass look more like Augusta National. The way the course is presented now is so Augusta cosplay. It's never going to be Augusta National, but the PGA Tour kind of wants to move it in that direction. And that is completely contrary to what Pete Dye would have wanted. Now, Pete Dye was certainly alive long enough and advising at TPC Sawgrass long enough to see this transformation of the course from its original rustic appearance to what it is now. Very green, verdant, probably softer and more watered than it should be, with the, with the flowers and,
the overseed.
the overseed, which might be necessary if you're going to have the championship in March. But listen, I mean, agronomy has advanced so far these days that there have to have been some other options. Something clicked for me when I looked at some photos and some footage of TPC Sawgrass in its early days, in the early and mid 80s. And that's that TPC Sawgrass originally was very Pinehurst number 2 like. Very. I think that's an under-discussed influence of both Pete Dye's and of TPC Sawgrass's. If you look at those original greens at TPC Sawgrass too, they were much more domed than they are now. They're very Pinehurst, and I still think they have some of that characteristic, but they've softened that over the years as well. In fact, they started to soften it in like 1983 after the first couple of Players Championships at TPC Sawgrass. The players were like, okay, we've got to tamp this down a little bit. But the initial greens that Dye built at TPC Sawgrass very much had a Pinehurst style to them. And I think the entire presentation of the course back then, the way the waste areas were, now the waste areas are just big, long, white bunkers. Originally, they looked Pinehursty. And I think that was a reference point for Pete Dye, who was very familiar with Pinehurst number 2. It was one of his favorite courses and one of the courses that he played and visited the most. I think Pinehurst number 2 was kind of that reference point for TPC Sawgrass, not Augusta National. In many ways, Pinehurst number 2 is kind of the anti-Augusta National among championship venues. And what I believe Dye wanted was for TPC Sawgrass to be much more toward the Pinehurst end of the spectrum. The PGA Tour over the last 40 years has moved TPC Sawgrass decisively toward the Augusta National end of the spectrum. And I think that is a betrayal of the original intention of the course and a good representation of how the PGA Tour has changed over the years. If you think about the original design of TPC Sawgrass and its original intentions as supplied by Dean Beeman and Pete Dye, it was to create this gnarly, difficult course that was spectator-centric and that was player-defiant. They wanted players to suffer and they wanted the spectators to watch and have a good time. And it's hard to imagine how much the mindset of the PGA Tour has changed since then. You would never see the PGA Tour these days prioritize spectator pleasure over player convenience. But that's exactly what the original conception of TPC Sawgrass was. And the way that the course has changed over the years represents the PGA Tour's change in mindset. Its move toward the players and away from the fan. And I think it's still a great golf course. It is still a brilliant golf course, but that's in spite of and not because of the changes that the PGA Tour has made to it. The fact that TPC Sawgrass is still great is a testament to how good it was originally. But the PGA Tour has done its best to make it not as great anymore. And that is a bummer.
There's so much there. I mean, I think the only pushback on the Augustification is that Augusta still plays firm. So you're like,
right.
Sawgrass.
They figure it out there. I mean, it's through high technology and everything.
Understood. But they're not sacrificing on the way the golf course is supposed to be played, versus Sawgrass, in greenifying itself, or whatever verb you want to use, is sacrificing explicitly on the firmness. There's more rain in March than there is in May. Like, it's going to play softer. So much there that to go in a lot of directions. I think one thing that's interesting in reading Bear Me in a Pop Bunker is seeing Tom Kite's comments in 1994, where he blasts the setup and says that they've gotten too easy. He talks about tournament officials being in love with the color green and lamenting the deterioration of the test, which is just an interesting example of the direction that professional golf started to go, and some of the conversations that we have now. Like, we were upset with the way the Honda Classic, now the Cognizant Classic, played this year and last year with all the overseed and how much they've neutered that golf course, trying to get more players to show up and not get beaten up by the golf course. Like, some of these conversations have been happening since the late 80s and the early 90s. And that's what's fascinating to me about TPC Sawgrass is it really does tell the story of professional golf, both from a pure golf standpoint, but also from some of the other considerations of the PGA Tour. Like Garrett, pace of play is unfortunately a relevant part of this conversation, where some of the decisions they make with setup, if the golf course played a lot firmer and faster and windier, like they wouldn't get done the first 2 rounds in the first 2 days. Like they'd be playing on Saturday morning every time. Now you have a little more.
We see it whenever there's foul weather at the Players Championship. They don't finish.
You'd have a little more daylight in May, right? Which is another reason to move it to that date. But it's a practical consideration that unfortunately compromises on the golf course. We'll see what they do with the bumpers this year on 17, where they grew up these thick collars for the 2024 tournament that's stopping balls from going in the water. Completely antithetical to the way that golf course should play. He would never. But again, I think the tour would say part of that is for pace of play. If we have a bunch of shots going in the water, then
the players are going to call over the officials and be like, can I drop it here? Can I drop it here? How about here?
It's going to take 20 minutes. So it's cool that's both for positive and negative reasons that Sawgrass really does tell the story of professional golf.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up, Joseph. Thank you so much for coming on the pod. This was a fun conversation and looking forward to the Players Championship. And I hope we've given people an idea of why we really love TPC Sawgrass, even if it looks different and plays different from a lot of the courses that we normally praise on Fried Egg Golf. This is a fascinating and important golf course, and it was very fun to talk about it with you.
Thanks, Garrett. Thanks for having me.
This episode of Designing Golf was produced by PJ Clark. Thank you, PJ. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive that Joseph and I just did into a particular golf course, I can guarantee that you would really love the content that we do in Club TFE. On a weekly basis, we publish extensive course profiles about golf courses that we really love, and in some cases, golf courses that we don't like that much, and those discussions can be equally interesting. But we're building what we think is a really strong and fun community in Club TFE around this kind of content and this discussion of golf course architecture, as well as golf in general. And we would really like you to join that community. So go to thefriedegg.com/membership and see what Club TFE is all about. Thank you for listening to Designing Golf. Give us a rating and review if you feel like it. And we'll see you again soon for another episode.